A billionaire learns that all his wealth means nothing when his daughter's world is changed forever by the simple hug of a kind-hearted waitress. The evening was filled with the kind of grandeur that only the richest people could put together. Glittering chandeliers shone brightly from the ceiling, their golden light bouncing off polished marble floors. Waiters in crisp black uniforms carried trays of sparkling glasses, weaving through the crowd with practiced ease. The air was filled with the soft sound of a string orchestra playing a waltz, while men in tailored suits and women in glittering gowns laughed, talked, and danced. Across the vast ballroom, it was a night of elegance, a night designed to impress. But for one little girl sitting quietly in the corner, the glitter and glamour meant very little. Emma Bennett, the daughter of Richard Bennett, one of the most powerful and wealthy businessmen in the country, sat on a chair at the far side of the ballroom. Her soft white dress shimmered under the lights, and her golden hair was tied neatly with a ribbon, but her small hands were clenched tightly in her lap. She watched the other children, sons and daughters of rich guests, moving gracefully across the floor. They twirled and laughed, their laughter mixing with the music. But Emma's eyes kept dropping to the floor whenever someone looked her way. The thought of stepping onto that wide-open dance floor filled her with dread. She wasn't like the other children, confident and carefree. She was shy, painfully shy, and the fear of everyone watching her was enough to glue her to her chair. Richard Bennett noticed his daughter's silence from across the room. He was speaking with a group of investors, smiling politely as they praised his success, but his eyes kept drifting to Emma. He had envisioned this night differently. He thought his daughter would shine under the chandeliers, dancing proudly, showing the world not just his fortune, but his family's happiness. Yet she sat there, small and still, her eyes filled with nervousness. Richard excused himself from his conversation and walked over to her. "Emma," said softly, kneeling beside her so his voice wouldn't carry to the crowd, "why don't you join the other children? Look, they're having fun." Emma shook her head quickly, her cheeks turning pink. "I don't want to, Daddy," she whispered, her voice trembling. Richard sighed. He was a man used to solving problems with quick decisions and money. In business, there was no challenge too great for him to overcome, but when it came to his daughter's trembling voice, his wealth meant nothing. He reached for her hand, trying again. "You don't have to be afraid. Everyone will love seeing you dance. You look so beautiful out there." Emma's eyes filled with tears and she pulled her hand away. "Please, Daddy, I don't want to." Richard froze. For a moment, he felt helpless in a way he rarely experienced. He could close million-dollar deals, manage entire corporations, and command respect from powerful men, but he could not convince his little girl to take a few steps onto a dance floor. The music swelled in the background. The couples twirled gracefully, but all Richard felt was the heavy weight of disappointment and confusion pressing down on him. He sat beside Emma, trying to mask his frustration. He told himself she was just a child, but deep inside he worried. Was she always going to be like this? Afraid, hesitant, and shy? He wanted his daughter to be confident, bold, and unafraid of the world. That was the future he imagined for her, yet here she was, shrinking into her chair while the other children glowed in the spotlight. The minutes passed slowly. Occasionally, guests would smile at Emma, encouraging her to join in, but she only looked down, refusing to meet their gaze. Richard tried to engage her with small jokes, but she forced a smile and quickly fell silent again. The gap between what he wanted for her and what she wanted for herself grew painfully clear. From her corner, Emma felt like she didn't belong. The music was too loud, the lights too bright, and the room too filled with eyes that seemed ready to judge her. Her heart pounded at the very idea of stepping out, of moving in front of so many people. She was not like the other children who moved as though the room was their stage. She preferred quiet moments, sitting by herself, dreaming of stories she read in books. She also felt the sting of letting her father down. She knew he wanted her to dance, to be brave, but she couldn't. No matter how much she tried, the fear held her back. Richard leaned back in his chair, his gaze wandering around the room once again. His empire had given him everything he could ever ask, for luxury, influence, and admiration. Yet none of it could help him reach into his daughter's heart at this moment. He wondered if perhaps he had focused too much on building his world of power and not enough on understanding the little world inside his daughter's mind. He tried to push the thought away, but it lingered like a quiet shadow. The orchestra played a livelier tune, and the crowd cheered as a few of the younger children showed off their steps. Richard's friends glanced at him, clearly noticing Emma's stillness. He forced a polite smile, pretending it didn't matter, but inside he felt a mix of embarrassment and sadness. This was supposed to be a perfect night, but now all he could think about was his daughter's silence in the middle of the noise. Emma shifted in her seat, hugging herself tightly. Her father's disappointed sighs only made her feel smaller. She wished she could disappear, wished no one would notice her. Her chest felt heavy, her eyes stung, but she held back her tears. She didn't want to cry here in front of all these strangers. She wanted to go home, back to her room where the world wasn't watching. As the night stretched on, the ballroom only grew livelier. Guests toasted champagne, clinking their glasses, while music filled every corner. But in the far side of the room, a quiet battle was taking place between a father's hope and a daughter's fear. Richard's mind swirled with thoughts of solutions, yet none came. Emma remained as still as ever, her small figure swallowed by the grandness of the night in that shining room, surrounded by power, wealth, and joy. One man discovered just how powerless he was when it came to the heart of his own child. And one little girl, hidden in the corner of her father's grand world, silently wished for something simple: comfort, not attention. It was a night that would begin with silence and hesitation, but it was only the beginning of a story neither of them could yet imagine. The music carried on in the grand ballroom, the sound of violins and pianos filling every corner of the space. Guests moved about, laughing and dancing, their jewels catching the light of the chandeliers. The waiters kept passing through, balancing trays of glasses and plates with practiced ease, their movements almost invisible against the glamour of the event. Among them was a young woman named Sarah, a waitress working her shift with quiet dedication. Unlike the others, she didn't seem overwhelmed by the wealth around her. She simply focused on her work, offering polite smiles, refilling drinks, clearing plates when needed. Sarah had learned long ago not to compare her life to the people she served. The gowns, the jewels, the expensive perfumes, they belonged to another world. Her world was far simpler, filled with long hours of work and the constant worry of paying bills. But she carried herself with calmness and warmth, qualities that stood out in a room where many wore masks of pride. As she moved past the edges of the ballroom, her eyes fell on a little girl sitting alone. The girl's dress shimmered beautifully, but her small shoulders were slouched, her hands clenched in her lap. Sarah had seen children laughing and dancing in the center of the floor all evening, but this one seemed to be lost in her own silence. Something about the way the child avoided everyone's eyes touched Sarah deeply, as she knew that look was the look of someone who felt out of place, someone afraid of being judged. She paused for a moment, tray in hand, and watched. The girl's father, whom Sarah immediately recognized as Richard Bennett, one of the wealthiest men in the city, had knelt beside her earlier, speaking softly. Yet the girl hadn't moved. Even now, while the music grew livelier, she remained frozen in her chair, almost as if the world was too heavy for her. Sarah felt an ache in her heart. She didn't know this child, didn't know her story, but she could sense her fear. Sarah thought back to her own childhood. She remembered being the shy girl in school, the one who sat in the corner, too afraid to raise her hand or join in games. She remembered how much she had longed for anyone to simply notice her and tell her it was okay to be herself. That memory pushed her to act. Setting her tray down on a nearby table, Sarah walked quietly toward the little girl. She moved gently, not wanting to startle her. The room around them was loud with laughter and music, but Sarah's footsteps were soft, almost invisible. When she reached the chair, she bent slightly, making sure she wasn't towering over the child. "Hi," Sarah said softly, her voice warm and gentle, almost like a whisper. "My name's Sarah. You look so lovely tonight." Emma glanced up, surprised. She had expected more people to tell her to dance, to push her toward the floor. But this woman's voice didn't carry any pressure. It was kind, almost like a friend's. Emma blinked, unsure of what to say, then lowered her eyes again. Sarah smiled and continued, "You don't really want to dance, do you?" The little girl's eyes widened slightly. For the first time that night, she felt understood. Slowly, she shook her head. "That's okay," Sarah said softly, kneeling beside her so their eyes were level. "You don't have to do anything you don't want to. Sometimes it's nice just to sit and watch." Emma's lips trembled, as though she was holding back tears. All evening, she had felt like she was letting everyone down, her father, the guests, maybe even herself. But this woman wasn't judging her. Instead, she was telling her it was perfectly fine to be the way she was. Sarah reached out carefully, making sure Emma was comfortable, and gently placed her hand on the girl's shoulder. And then, without saying much more, she gave Emma a soft, reassuring hug. It wasn't the kind of hug that demanded anything, nor was it too long or overwhelming. It was simply a gesture of kindness, one that carried warmth and acceptance. For Emma, that hug felt like a lifeline. She had been drowning in her fear all night, but in that single moment, she felt safe. She let herself lean into the hug, her small arms wrapping back around Sarah almost instinctively. For the first time that evening, her tense shoulders loosened, and the tightness in her chest seemed to fade. Across the room, Richard Bennett watched with astonishment. He had been pacing silently, unsure how to help his daughter, when he saw the waitress approach her. At first, he thought it was out of place, a server speaking to his child. But as he saw Emma melt into Sarah's arms, his breath caught in his throat. All his attempts to reassure Emma had failed, yet this young woman, with no wealth, no power, had done what he could not. She had broken through his daughter's wall of fear with nothing more than kindness. Richard felt a strange mix of emotions. Part of him was surprised, another part was grateful, and a deeper part was unsettled. He had always believed that he could provide his daughter with everything she needed, yet here she was, finding comfort in the arms of someone who had none of his fortune. He watched them silently, realizing he was witnessing something far more powerful than all the wealth displayed in the glittering ballroom. Meanwhile, Emma held on to Sarah for just a little longer. "Everyone wants me to dance," she whispered into Sarah's shoulder, her voice trembling. "But I'm scared." Sarah pulled back slightly, looking into the girl's teary eyes. "It's okay to be scared," she said gently. "You don't have to dance if you don't want to. Sometimes being brave doesn't mean doing what others expect, it just means being honest about how you feel." Emma sniffled, her tears finally spilling. But they weren't tears of shame anymore. They were tears of relief. She had carried her fear alone all night. But now someone had told her it was okay to feel that way. Sarah wiped a tear from Emma's cheek with the edge of her napkin, smiling softly. "And if you ever do feel like dancing, even just a little step, I'll be right here cheering for you." Emma gave the smallest nod, her lips curving into a shy, grateful smile. The hug, the words, the gentle presence, all of it, had created a quiet transformation. In the middle of a grand ballroom filled with riches, the richest moment of the night was happening quietly in the corner, unnoticed by most. It was not about music or dancing or wealth. It was about a waitress who cared enough to see the fear in a little girl's eyes and give her the one thing she needed most: comfort. Richard, standing at a distance, felt his throat tighten. He could barely remember the last time his daughter had smiled like that, even if it was small and hesitant. And all it had taken was the touch of a stranger with no agenda, no expectation, just kindness. He realized then that he was witnessing something he could never buy, no matter how vast his fortune was. As Sarah stood up to return to her work, Emma reached out quickly and held her hand for a moment. She didn't say anything, but her small gesture said enough. Sarah gave her hand a gentle squeeze before walking away, leaving Emma sitting there with a lighter heart. The music played on. The laughter continued, and the party carried forward in all its extravagance. But for Richard and Emma, something had shifted. And though the other guests might never notice it, that quiet hug in the corner had already begun to change everything. Richard stood quietly in the corner of the ballroom, watching his daughter as she sat calmer now than she had been all night. She had not stepped onto the dance floor, but the tears that had shimmered in her eyes earlier were gone. Instead, she looked almost at peace, thanks to the gentle waitress who had knelt beside her and hugged her with such warmth. The image replayed in Richard's mind again and again, the way Emma had leaned into the stranger's arms, the way her small body had finally relaxed after hours of tension. It was such a simple thing, yet it had done what he could not. He felt a heaviness in his chest, the kind of weight that came not from pride but from realization. He had spent his entire life mastering control, mastering power. In boardrooms, on stages, in meetings, he always knew what to say, how to act, how to command attention. But with his daughter, with the one person who mattered more to him than anything else in the world, he suddenly felt powerless. All the money he had, all the luxury he had built, could not give Emma the comfort that a poor waitress had just offered so naturally. Richard thought back to the many moments he had missed in Emma's life. He remembered the birthdays he had attended late because a meeting had run too long, the bedtime stories he had promised to read but had forgotten after long days of work, the times she had tried to tell him something important, but he had brushed her off with a distracted later. At the time, he told himself he was doing it all for her, building an empire so she would never know struggle, never know fear. Yet tonight, watching her shrink away from the world and then come alive only when a stranger showed her kindness, he wondered if he had misunderstood what she truly needed. The orchestra shifted into another song, but Richard barely heard it. He was lost in his own thoughts, his eyes fixed on Emma. He saw the way she smiled faintly to herself now, a smile that came not from expensive dresses or grand parties, but from being understood. The smile was worth more than any deal he had ever made, and yet it had not come from him. That realization hurt. His mind drifted back to when Emma was smaller, just a toddler. He remembered the way she would run to him when he returned home, her little arms reaching up with excitement. Back then, she had not cared about his wealth or his work. She had only wanted him, but as she grew older, he had begun to replace time with gifts. He had thought a new toy, a fancy dress, or a big celebration would make her happy. And perhaps for a while, it had distracted her. But underneath, the truth had always been the same. She wanted his presence, not his presence now. Sitting in the middle of a room full of people, Richard realized how far he had drifted from that simple truth. His daughter did not need him to buy her confidence. She needed him to understand her fears. She did not need him to push her onto the stage. She needed him to hold her hand while she found the courage on her own. The waitress had understood that instantly. She hadn't pressured Emma, hadn't demanded she be brave in front of everyone. She had simply told her it was okay to feel scared, and somehow, those words had given Emma more strength than all his encouragement combined. Richard felt a sting of shame. How could a stranger see his daughter so clearly when he, her own father, had failed? He had been so focused on appearances, wanting her to dance, to shine in front of others, that he had ignored what she truly needed. The thought unsettled him, because it forced him to admit something he rarely admitted. He had been wrong. He glanced at Sarah, the waitress, who was now moving quietly between tables again, carrying a tray with steady hands. She blended back into her role, unnoticed by most, but Richard could not stop noticing her. She had no wealth, no power, no influence, yet she carried something far more valuable: empathy. In her simple gesture of kindness, she had done what he had been too blind to do for a long while. Richard remained lost in these reflections. He thought about his own father, a strict man who had built his life on discipline and work. Richard had inherited that mindset, believing success was measured by achievements, by how others saw you. Maybe that was why he had wanted Emma to dance so badly, because it would prove to the world that his family was as perfect as his empire. But now, he began to see the flaw in that thinking. What good was perfection in the eyes of others if his own daughter felt small and unseen? He turned his gaze back to Emma. She was still seated, but her shoulders were no longer curled inward. She seemed lighter, freer, as though the hug had taken away some of the fear she carried. Richard realized then that his daughter didn't need him to push her into the spotlight. What she needed was for him to sit beside her in the shadows until she was ready to step out on her own. That was the role he had been missing all along. The ballroom buzzed with laughter and clinking glasses, but for Richard, the noise faded into the background. All he could hear was the quiet voice of truth whispering inside him. He had to change. Not for the sake of appearances, not for the sake of his business, but for Emma. He had to learn to listen, to slow down, to be there. In the small moments that seemed insignificant, but carried the deepest meaning, his thoughts wandered to the future. What kind of father did he want Emma to remember? He wanted her to look back and see a man who was always busy, always absent, always pushing her to be what she wasn't? Or did he want her to remember someone who understood her, who supported her, who made her feel safe, even when the world felt overwhelming? The answer was clear, and it burned in his chest with urgency. Richard felt something shift within him that night. He had always measured his worth by the size of his empire, but now he saw that the real measure of his life was the heart of his daughter. If he failed her, no amount of wealth would matter. And if he succeeded with her, if he gave her love, patience, and understanding, then he would be the richest man in ways that money could never buy. As he stood there, his eyes once again landed on Sarah. He knew he would have to speak to her later. Not because she had done something extraordinary in the eyes of the world, but because she had done something extraordinary in the eyes of his daughter. She had reminded him of what truly mattered. For the rest of the evening, Richard stayed close to Emma, not urging her to dance anymore, but simply sitting with her, watching her in silence. Every so often she would glance at him and he would give her a small smile, one that said, "It's okay, I'm here." It wasn't grand or dramatic, but it felt right inside his heart. Richard made a quiet promise to himself. He would no longer let his empire steal him away from his daughter's world. He would pay attention to her fears, her dreams, her little joys. He would become the father she needed, not the one he thought he should be. And as the music swelled once again, and the chandeliers glowed above, Richard understood something he had never truly grasped before. Sometimes the greatest lessons in life don't come from power or wealth, they come from the smallest, simplest acts of kindness. Eat! And sometimes it takes a stranger's hug to remind a father of the love he had almost forgotten how to give. The night of the gala ended, but the memory of it stayed fresh in Richard's mind. He could not forget the sight of Emma leaning into the arms of the waitress Sarah, and how that simple moment had shifted everything. It was not just a hug. It was a spark that had opened his eyes. For days after, he found himself thinking about it. He thought about his daughter's smile, faint but real, and about the young woman who had shown more understanding in one evening than he had managed. In years, Richard was not the kind of man to ignore something that moved him so deeply. In business, when he noticed talent, he nurtured it. When he saw potential, he invested in it. And now, as a father, he realized that Sarah's kindness was not something he could forget or treat as a passing gesture. He wanted to know more about her, not out of curiosity alone, but because she had reached his daughter in a way no one else could. The next week, Richard asked the hotel manager about her. He learned that Sarah was a hardworking waitress who often took double shifts. She was polite, dependable, but lived a modest life. She came from a small neighborhood and worked not just for herself, but to support her younger siblings. The manager spoke of her with respect, saying she never complained, even when the work was heavy. Richard listened carefully, and each word only increased his admiration for her. One afternoon, he made arrangements to meet Sarah outside of her job. She was surprised when she received the message, nervous even. For someone like her, a meeting with a billionaire was unimaginable. She worried she might be in trouble for speaking with his daughter during the gala. But when they met, Richard quickly eased her fears. He thanked her sincerely for what she had done for Emma that night. His voice, usually sharp and commanding, carried a softness that startled even him. "I've spent years trying to give my daughter everything she could ever want," he confessed. "But you gave her something I never could, a moment of understanding. That hug meant more than I can put into words." Sarah blushed at his gratitude, shaking her head. "I didn't do anything special. I just saw a little girl who was scared." and I remembered what that felt like. Sometimes all someone needs is to be told it's okay. Her words touched Richard even more. They were simple, yet they carried wisdom. He realized she lived by truths he had long forgotten in his pursuit of wealth. That day, he asked if she would be willing to spend some time with Emma, not as a nanny or employee, but simply as a friend. At first, Sarah hesitated. She didn't belong in the world of billionaires, and she feared people would misunderstand. But when she thought about Emma's tearful eyes that night, she agreed. From then on, Sarah became a quiet but steady presence in Emma's life. She visited often, sometimes after her shifts, sometimes on weekends. She and Emma would sit together, talking about books, stories, or little things Emma was too shy to share with others. Sarah never pushed her to be brave, never forced her to change. She simply listened, comforted, and encouraged Emma in small ways. Slowly, Emma began to open up. Richard watched this transformation with awe. He saw his daughter laughing more, speaking with more confidence, even daring to try new things. One afternoon, Emma surprised him by showing a small dance step she had practiced with Sarah in the living room. It wasn't on a grand stage. It wasn't in front of hundreds of eyes. But it was in front of someone she trusted. And that made all the difference. For Richard, these moments became lessons. He sat with Sarah sometimes, talking quietly about life. She shared stories of her own childhood, how she had grown up without much money, but had always been surrounded by love. Her parents had worked hard, but they always made time for her. They had taught her that even when life was difficult, kindness was a strength no one could take away. Richard listened, humbled. He realized that Sarah's strength did not come from wealth, but from love and resilience. The bond between Sarah and Emma grew deeper. Emma would often ask, "When is Sarah coming?" Her eyes lit up whenever she saw her. She trusted Sarah in a way she didn't trust many others. For Richard, it was strange at first to see his daughter drawn to someone outside their circle of wealth and influence, but over time, he began to see it as a gift. Sarah was giving Emma something he could not buy, the freedom to be herself. One day, Emma invited Sarah to join them on a family outing. They went to a park, something so simple but so meaningful. Emma ran ahead, her laughter filling the air. While Sarah and Richard walked behind, Richard found himself opening up to Sarah in ways he rarely did with anyone. He spoke about his fears as a father, his regrets, and his desire to be better. Sarah listened quietly, then said something that stayed with him. "Children don't remember the money we spend on them. They remember how we made them feel. If she feels safe with you, if she feels loved, that will stay with her forever." Those words sank deep into Richard's heart. He thought about his childhood again, about how his father had been distant, always busy, always stern. He had grown up wanting his father's approval, but it had rarely come. Without realizing it, he had been repeating that cycle with Emma. But now, he had a chance to break it. The more time Sarah spent with them, the more Richard realized that true family wasn't about blood or wealth. It was about connection. Emma had found a friend in Sarah, someone who saw her for who she was. And in a way, Richard had found a teacher in her too. She was showing him what it meant to truly see his daughter, to meet her where she was instead of pushing her into places she wasn't ready for. Even the staff in Richard's home noticed the change. Emma's laughter echoed in the halls more. Often, she walked with a little more confidence, her shoulders no longer slouched. Richard himself seemed different too. He began canceling some meetings to spend evenings with his daughter. He read her stories at night, even if he stumbled over the words. He asked her about her day and listened carefully. And every time, Emma's eyes shone with a happiness that no expensive gift had ever given her. The unlikely bond between the billionaire's daughter and the struggling waitress became something remarkable. To outsiders, it might have seemed strange, even unbelievable. But to Emma and Richard, it was the most natural thing in the world. Sarah's kindness had built a bridge between two worlds that rarely touched. And on that bridge, a little girl found her confidence and a father found his heart as the weeks turned into months. Richard no longer cared about what others thought. He saw the results in his daughter's smile, in her growing courage, in the warmth that filled their home. For the first time in years, he felt truly rich, not because of his empire, but because of the love he was learning to give and receive. And all of it had begun with one small hug in the corner of a glittering ballroom, a hug that had changed the course of their lives. The changes in Richard's life did not come all at once, but they came steadily, like gentle ripples spreading across water. After Sarah became part of Emma's world, Richard began to see life with different eyes. He noticed details he had ignored before: the way Emma's eyes lit up when she felt understood, the way her laughter filled the room when she felt safe, the way small gestures mattered more to her than the expensive gifts he used to buy. It was as if a veil had been lifted, and for the first time, could see clearly what really mattered. He began spending more time with Emma, but not in the way he used to. He didn't plan grand events to show her off, and he didn't pressure her to act brave in front of others. Instead, he started to slow down and simply be with her. They read together, they painted silly pictures. Sometimes they just sat in the garden, talking about nothing and everything. For Richard, these moments were new and strange. In the past, silence had made him restless. He always needed to be doing something important. But now, sitting quietly beside his daughter, listening to her soft voice, he felt a peace he had never known. Emma, too, began to change. She no longer clung to her fears as tightly as she once had. The memory of that night at the gala still stayed with her, but now it no longer felt like a wound. It felt like the start of something. With Sarah by her side, she felt braver. With her father showing her patience instead of disappointment, she felt safer. The shy girl who had once hidden in the corner was slowly learning to take small steps forward, and each one filled her with pride. Richard noticed that whenever Emma spoke of Sarah, her words carried joy. One evening, Emma told him, "Daddy, Sarah makes me feel like I don't have to be someone else. She likes me the way I am." That simple sentence struck Richard's heart. He realized that all along, he had been trying to shape Emma into what he thought she should be: confident, fearless, and bold, without understanding that what she needed first was acceptance. Sarah had given her that acceptance freely, and it had unlocked something inside Emma that he had been unable to reach. Richard's gratitude towards Sarah grew into something more than words. He found himself reflecting on the difference between the world he had built and the world she lived in. He had always believed that wealth was the key to solving problems. But Sarah showed him that love and kindness were the real treasures. She didn't have much money, yet she had given his daughter the greatest gift of all. That truth humbled him. In time, Richard began making changes not only in his personal life, but in his business as well. He started initiatives to help children from underprivileged backgrounds, focusing not just on education, but on emotional support. He funded programs that offered mentorship, safe spaces, and counselors who could listen to children who felt invisible. He knew that no amount of money could erase loneliness or fear, but he also knew that creating places where children felt seen and valued could change their lives. Every time he signed a new project, he thought of Emma and of Sarah, remembering how one small act of kindness had transformed his family. Emma flourished in these new surroundings. Slowly, she found her courage, not because she was pushed, but because she was supported. One day, months after the gala, she surprised her father by standing up during a family gathering and reciting a poem she had written. Her voice shook at first, but she carried on, and when she finished, her cheeks glowed with pride. Richard's eyes filled with tears as he clapped for her. It wasn't the dance he had once dreamed of, but it was something far greater: his daughter showing the world a piece of herself on her own terms. Sarah remained an important part of their lives. She became like family, someone Emma trusted deeply, and someone Richard respected immensely. She never asked for anything in return, never took advantage of their wealth. She continued to live simply, working hard, caring for her siblings, and giving time to Emma whenever she could. Richard admired her honesty, her strength, and her ability to stay grounded despite the differences between their worlds. She reminded him daily that kindness was not about status, but about choice. The night of the gala slowly became a story Richard often told, not in public speeches or business meetings, but in private conversations with close friends. He would describe how his daughter had been too scared to dance, how he had felt powerless, and how a young waitress had changed everything with nothing more than a hug. Each time he told the story, his voice carried the weight of the lesson he had learned. He wanted people to understand that life's greatest riches were not found in banks or companies, but in moments of love, in the courage to care, and in the humility to learn from others. For Emma, the change was even more personal. She grew up carrying the memory of that hug as a turning point in her life. Whenever she faced fear, she remembered Sarah's words, "It's okay to be scared. It's okay to be yourself." Those words became her anchor, guiding her through school, friendships, and later challenges in life. And through it all, she also remembered how her father had changed, not instantly, not perfectly, but with a real effort that made her feel loved. Years later, Emma would look back on that night and realize how extraordinary it had been. A glittering ballroom, a world of wealth. And yet the most powerful thing had happened quietly in the corner, unnoticed by most. A waitress had hugged a scared little girl, and in that hug was the seed of transformation. It had changed a father, reshaped a family, and inspired acts of kindness that reached far beyond them. For Richard, the journey was not about becoming the richest man in the world anymore. It was about becoming the kind of father his daughter could trust and love. He continued to build his empire, but he never again allowed it to come before Emma. He made time for her stories, her fears, her little victories, and every time he saw her smile, he felt richer than any fortune could make him. And so, the night that began with silence and fear ended as the foundation of something far greater. It taught a man that love could not be bought. It gave a little girl the courage to grow. It reminded everyone who heard the story that sometimes the smallest acts, the ones most people overlook, are the ones that change everything forever.